I was going to make a video about this many months ago, but certain things got in the way. Anyway, a couple months ago, Vladimir Putin compared himself to Peter the Great. Peter the Great was a Russian Tsar or emperor that basically founded the Russian Empire, and under his reign he rapidly expanded Russian territory. Essentially, Putin is alluding to Russia's glory days in order to assert Russia's sovereignty over the current territory Russia controls, as well as all the countries around Russia, namely Ukraine. So in a way, this is part of his justification for the war in Ukraine. But he's making a much deeper illusion about the power he holds in particular, and how it connects to those glory days, but it goes back a lot further. So where does Putin's egotistical idea of empire and his right to rule come from? Well, believe it or not, the Roman Empire still haunts global politics to this day. The Roman Empire was Europe's first empire. It stretched all the way from Portugal in the east to the Persian Gulf in the west, from the wilds of modern-day Scotland in the north to all the way to the Nile in the south. Rome was built upon the architecture, the philosophy, and the mythology of the Greeks before them, but they also created a lot of stuff themselves. Plumbing and sanitation, central heating, concrete, aqueducts, new military tactics, the postal system, apartment buildings, Roman numerals, the basis of the modern calendar, bound books, durable roads and archways, to name a few of their inventions, as well as a lot of law, which forms the basis of much of the law of many modern-day countries. Complete side note, but interestingly, Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Judeo-Christian values are how many justify the West's, or what they believe to be the West's, morally superior position in the world, which obviously is completely wrong, and it's often used to spread xenophobia, these so-called Western values. But anyway. The Roman Empire saw a lot of innovation and general human development, something all countries see as admirable qualities, despite the Romans' many faults. But the main connection here is with Rome's control over vast areas and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In short, Putin wants the buffer zone that the Soviet Union lost when it collapsed, and is vital for Russia's defense, as it's very vulnerable in the North European plain, which is an area of flat land that makes Russia very vulnerable from attack from the West. Of course, this is not the main cause of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's just one aspect to consider. Another link is that the Roman Empire was led by the gloriously egotistical, fantastically rich, and often insane emperors, the Caesars. The story of how the Caesars have influenced European history is very messy, but I'll try to do it justice. 200 years before Rome fell, the Emperor Diocletian split the Roman Empire in two. The western half, which went on to fall 200 years later, and the eastern half, which historians later named the Byzantine Empire, and that went on to last for another 1,000 years or so. Though it was through steady decline, it wasn't really an empire at the end. Even so, the Byzantine Empire basically preserved Rome's legacy for about 1,000 years. They also traded with the Vikings and built one of the most famous monuments in the world, Hagia Sophia. Meanwhile, in the West, in 800 CE, the Frankish king Charlemagne crowned himself Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, in direct reference to the Roman emperors. And this actually caused tension with Empress Irene of the Eastern Byzantine, but still Roman Empire. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire finally fell to the Ottoman Empire, and the new ruler, Mehmed II, declared himself Caesar of all Romans. What is really interesting about all these successive empires, and the empires that will come after, is that they weren't really Roman. The Byzantines are the only ones who really have the claim to being Roman. The Ottomans were completely culturally separate, and the Holy Roman Empire in its structure was completely different to an actual cohesive empire. It was more a collection of different kingdoms and states that elected an emperor. The Holy Roman Empire slowly declined and dissolved in 1806, but still the legacy of the Roman Empire persisted. When Napoleon crowned himself in 1804, he declared himself Emperor of all the French, in reference to Charlemagne, and of course the Roman emperors of yore. And actually, the Holy Roman Emperors had styled themselves as Kaisers, derived from the word Caesar, and that term was still used in the later German Empire right up to World War I with Kaiser Wilhelm II. And of course there was plenty of obsession over Greece and Rome within Mussolini's fascists and Hitler's Nazis, but that is a whole can of worms we won't go into. Meanwhile, in the East, Ivan the Terrible of Russia actually married the niece of the final Byzantine emperor, and because of this he was able to style himself as Tsar, derived of course from Caesar, like Kaiser. And years later, Peter the Great formally established the Russian Empire, and this is where we circle back. The Tsars were overthrown, of course, and communism happened, but the USSR had its fair share of absolute leaders. The USSR collapsed, and with this enormous legacy behind him, it has left Vladimir Putin. I'll admit I've covered a lot of ground in this video, and there are so many rabbit holes I could have gone down, but this is the final, most important point. The Roman Empire started the European rulers' obsession with imperialism, but also these egotistical ideas of themselves. And this is actually a perfect example of why learning about history matters. From a very scientific, observational view, it's very important to understand this history, to understand politics and the motivations of world leaders. And from the point of view of a responsible citizen, understanding the history helps us to recognise dangerous points of view, like the Western values I mentioned earlier. They stem from an obsession with antiquity that is then used to justify racist and imperialist views. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, it helps us to recognise at least part of Putin's psyche. Now, he's obviously a narcissist, you don't need an understanding of Rome's legacy in Europe to understand that, but it shows that he thinks he is justified. He thinks that the legacy of the Tsars, stretching all the way back to Rome, is justification not just to expand Russian territory, but to hold absolute power for himself, like the Tsars and like the Caesars. There'll be a lot of links to a couple of videos on subjects I didn't quite get to cover. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you later.